embarrass this community tonight.
You just endangered my unborn child.
Excuse me, that dress violates community standards, Victoria Langley said, fingers already pinching fabric like she owned it. This is a private event, I replied, stepping between her and my wife. The board chair smiled, tight and rehearsed, and tugged anyway. The sound wasn't loud, just a soft rip, silk giving way under authority that assumed it could. Gasps rolled through the ballroom. The enforcer in crimson froze, then straightened, chin high, as if the moment still belonged to her. That's when I said the thing she didn't expect to hear. I told her this venue was insured under a policy I'd personally audited. I told her physical interference triggered exposure she couldn't undo. Her smile flickered. Not fear, confusion. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. I'm Marcus Ellison. I assess liability for a living. I map how one bad decision becomes a cascade no committee can vote away. And while the tyrant in heels adjusted her posture and waved for security, I was already counting the seconds between negligence and consequence. My wife's hand tightened around mine. Her breathing changed. The clipboard queen didn't notice. She was busy restoring decorum. The gala was supposed to be safe. A charity night, polished smiles, donors in tuxedos, the promise that rules existed to make things orderly. My wife had chosen that gown carefully, weeks earlier, standing in our bedroom with one hand on her belly, asking if it was too much. It wasn't. It was dignity stitched into silk. When Victoria Langley tore it, she tore more than fabric. She crossed a line that doesn't forgive intent. The room shifted. People whispered. Phones hovered. The board chair spoke about standards and appearances, about how exceptions erode culture. I watched my wife's face pale. I watched her body tense in a way I'd learned to read during prenatal visits. The music kept playing, oblivious. Somewhere near the bar, a glass shattered. I asked for space. The enforcer in crimson refused, insisting we comply and leave. Then my wife bent forward, a sharp intake of breath cutting through the noise. The words came out halting. Something's wrong. The gown slipped from her shoulder, ruined and irrelevant. A dark stain spread across marble tiles. The tyrant in heels stepped back, finally uncertain. Someone shouted for a medic. Someone else called an ambulance. The clipboard queen tried to reframe, saying stress happens, accidents happen, no one meant harm. But meaning doesn't matter when risk becomes real. I knew the thresholds: physical contact, public venue, medical emergency, witnesses everywhere. The gala lights felt too bright as I knelt, holding my wife, counting breaths, counting exposures. The board chair hovered, issuing instructions that no one followed anymore. Authority drains fast when reality interrupts. We moved through a corridor that smelled like flowers and spilled champagne. The venue manager stammered apologies, eyes darting between us and Victoria Langley. I told him to document everything: times, statements, who touched whom. He nodded, pale. Somewhere behind us, the enforcer in crimson argued with staff, trying to preserve control. It was already gone. At the ambulance doors, a nurse asked what happened. I said the truth, clean and simple. An HOA president enforced decorum with her hands. My wife went into labor. Pens paused, eyes lifted. The story locked itself into records that don't forget. As the doors closed, I looked back once. The tyrant in heels stood alone under chandeliers, surrounded by people who suddenly understood distance. This wasn't about a dress. It was about what happens when social power mistakes itself for immunity. Where are you watching from? The ambulance door shut, and the night swallowed the Gala behind us. In the hospital intake bay, the air smelled like disinfectant and urgency, and the rhythm of alarms replaced string music. A nurse asked my wife's name, gestational week, allergies. I answered while watching her face, pale but focused, the way she got when pain demanded attention. Somewhere between triage and a curtained room, the reality settled. This wasn't an incident anymore. It was a chain. Phones buzzed before the IV finished dripping. The first message came from a neighbor who'd been at the event, asking if we were okay. The second came from the venue manager, apologizing again, promising statements. The third came from Victoria Langley herself, clipped and formal, offering concern while reminding me the HOA would review decorum procedures. The board chair didn't ask how my wife was. She asked how to contain the story. In the waiting area, I sat with my hands clasped, counting breaths and patterns the way I always did when assessing exposure. Physical interference, medical emergency, public venue. The enforcer in crimson had crossed a threshold that no apology could reverse. I watched a television cycle through local news teasers and wondered how long it would take before a society reporter connected the dots. The clipboard queen underestimated how fast information travels when witnesses feel wronged. At dawn, a nurse returned with paperwork. Times, observations, a brief note about the torn gown, documented because it mattered to the timeline. I asked her to include the names of anyone who touched my wife. She nodded, practiced, and wrote carefully. Documentation is gravity. It pulls truth into place. By mid-morning, messages multiplied. A resident I barely knew wrote to say this wasn't the first time. Last summer, the tyrant in heels had publicly scolded a teenager over shoes at a pool party. In spring, she'd barred a widow from a luncheon for non-compliant attire. Each time, people complied, embarrassed and quiet. Each time, authority learned it worked. Patterns don't hide when you line them up. The HOA management liaison called next, voice smooth, suggesting we keep things private to avoid unnecessary disruption. I told him privacy wasn't a lever he could pull. He mentioned insurance. I asked which carrier. Silence followed. When he spoke again, he said he'd get back to me. That told me everything. The clipboard queen had never tested the policy she leaned on. Outside the maternity ward, I paced and watched families move past with balloons and flowers. The contrast sharpened my resolve. This wasn't about revenge. It was about stopping a system that treated people like props. Victoria Langley's power thrived on hesitation. Remove that, and the structure shakes. By afternoon, a local journalist left a voicemail, polite and curious, asking for comment about a disturbance at the Gala. I didn't call back, not yet. The enforcer in crimson would try to frame this as a misunderstanding. I needed the record complete before the narrative hardened. When my wife slept, I opened my notebook and sketched the cascade. Venue liability, HOA event endorsement, personal conduct exclusions. The moment the tyrant in heels grabbed fabric, she stepped outside protected lanes. The board chair's insistence on decorum transformed into personal action. That distinction matters. It changes who pays. Another message arrived, this one from Eleanor Price, the event coordinator. She wrote that she was shaken, that she'd never seen things go that far, that she'd been told to stand down. Her words hesitated between lines. A conflicted witness, weighing reputation against conscience. I replied with one sentence. Tell the truth. and you won't stand alone. As evening fell, I returned to my wife's bedside. Her hand found mine, steady. The monitors hummed. Somewhere across town, Victoria Langley convened calls and drafted statements. She believed control could be restored with procedure. She was wrong. Control had already shifted, quietly, into records and policies that don't bend. The hospital corridor felt narrower the longer I stood there. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and every footstep echoed like a reminder that this night hadn't ended with the ambulance doors. It had only changed locations. I watched the entrance to the maternity ward, waiting for updates, when I saw Eleanor Price step off the elevator. She didn't spot me at first. Her shoulders were pulled tight, posture folded inward, as if she were bracing against an invisible wind. She stopped near the vending machines and stared at the floor. One hand kept smoothing the front of her jacket, over and over, a nervous reflex that betrayed more than words could. When she finally looked up and met my eyes, she flinched. The conflicted witness didn't smile. She swallowed, then walked toward me with careful steps, like someone approaching a line she wasn't sure she was allowed to cross. "I'm so sorry," she said, voice low. Her gaze flicked toward the nurse's station, then back to me. I keep replaying it. I nodded, but didn't interrupt. Silence gives people room to reveal themselves. Eleanor folded her arms, then unfolded them, then clasped her hands together. She described how Victoria Langley had insisted on handling the dress code issue personally, how the board chair brushed past staff and took control, saying it was an HOA matter. Eleanor's fingers twisted as she spoke. Each detail seemed to weigh on her chest. "She told me not to intervene," Eleanor added. "Said it would look unprofessional if I contradicted her in public." The enforcer in crimson had framed dominance as order, and everyone else had stepped back. As Eleanor spoke, her body leaned forward, then back, torn between urgency and fear. She kept glancing at her phone, which buzzed without mercy. Messages from the clipboard queen, no doubt, reminding her of contracts and future work. The tyrant in heels understood leverage. Eleanor did too. I asked her one question. Who authorized physical contact? Eleanor's breath caught. She shook her head, once, sharply. "No one," she said. "That's the thing. We're trained never to touch guests. Never." Her shoulders sagged, relief and dread mixing together. Saying it out loud made it real. Down the hall, a nurse pushed a cart past us, wheels squeaking softly. Eleanor stepped aside, then returned, hands trembling now. She told me the venue manager had hesitated, unsure whether the HOA president outranked his authority during the event. She told me staff had been warned not to contradict Victoria Langley in front of donors. Each sentence tightened the knot of liability I'd been mapping since dawn. "I can write a statement," Eleanor said finally, "but if I do, I don't know what happens next." Her eyes searched my face, measuring risk. I told her the truth. That statements don't create consequences. Actions do. That honesty doesn't guarantee safety, but silence guarantees repetition. The board chair thrived on people choosing the easier path. Breaking that pattern required discomfort. Eleanor nodded slowly. Her spine straightened, just a fraction. She pulled out her phone and typed a note, thumbs hovering before committing. The conflicted witness was deciding who she wanted to be remembered as. Later, alone again, I checked my messages. Victoria Langley had sent another note, this one sharper, warning against unsubstantiated narratives. The clipboard queen believed intimidation could still shape outcomes. She didn't know Eleanor had crossed the threshold. When the doctor finally approached with an update, relief washed through me in a wave that left my knees weak. My wife was stable. The baby was being monitored. I thanked him and returned to the waiting area, where Eleanor sat quietly, drafting her account. Across town, the enforcer in crimson was likely assembling her version of events. Here, under harsh lights and honest hands, another version was taking shape, one written with pauses, trembling fingers, and the unmistakable weight of truth. Morning arrived without permission. The hospital cafeteria smelled of burnt coffee and disinfectant, and the windows showed a gray sky that matched my mood. I sat alone at a corner table, reviewing timelines in my head when my phone lit up with notifications. Victoria Langley had decided the night wasn't over. Her email arrived first, copied to half the board, the venue manager, and an insurance address I recognized. The board chair framed the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding, a lapse in decorum aggravated by stress. She attached a draft statement and requested immediate concurrence. The enforcer in crimson wanted consensus before facts could harden. I didn't respond. Silence, used correctly, forces the other side to move. An hour later, the clipboard queen escalated. A courier arrived with a letter asserting violations, demanding reimbursement for event disruption, and threatening fines. The tyrant in heels was building a paper wall, hoping it would feel like authority. I watched the courier leave, then photographed the envelope, time-stamped and unopened. By noon, I relocated to the venue's loading bay, a new primary battlefield. Trucks idled, staff whispered. The private manager avoided eye contact. I asked for the incident log, not as a request, but as a routine compliance inquiry. My tone stayed calm. Calm unsettles bullies. The manager produced a redacted page. I noticed the gap immediately. The timeline skipped the moment of contact. The omission wasn't accidental. It was risk management by erasure. I thanked him and asked who ordered the edit. He hesitated, then said the board chair had called before dawn. That call mattered. It shifted responsibility from individual impulse to organizational control. Liability doesn't fear outrage. It fears patterns. Outside, reporters gathered for a charity follow-up. The enforcer in crimson arrived late, heels clicking, smile fixed. Victoria Langley greeted donors, then spotted me. Her eyes narrowed, calculating. She approached with practiced warmth and spoke about unity, about moving forward. I listened, nodded once, and asked a single question about insurance notification timing. The smile faltered. The clipboard queen knew the rule. Late notice voids protection. She pivoted, invoking legal counsel. I welcomed it. Lawyers slow narratives, but they also freeze improvisation. The tyrant in heels preferred speed. Back at the hospital, Eleanor Price texted that her statement was submitted to the venue and copied to the carrier. The conflicted witness had chosen daylight. I replied with thanks and nothing else. Gratitude should be simple. By evening, the board chair sent a revised memo. This one blamed third-party interference and proposed a private settlement. The enforcer in crimson wanted quiet money, not open math. I forwarded the memo to the carrier, with a brief note highlighting inconsistencies. Facts don't need adjectives. At sunset, I stood outside the maternity ward again. Machines beeped softly. My wife slept. The torn gown was sealed in a bag, tagged, preserved. Evidence ages well when handled properly, Victoria Langley called. I let it ring. Power hates unanswered phones. When night settled, the first confirmation arrived. The carrier acknowledged receipt and requested full logs, staff statements, and security footage. The clipboard queen's shortcuts had triggered scrutiny. The tyrant in heels had mistaken social authority for procedural immunity. I closed my eyes and exhaled. This part wasn't about winning. It was about narrowing exits. Tomorrow, the board would learn how expensive haste becomes when documentation starts talking. I checked the time and wrote a final note to myself, a checklist of thresholds crossed and coverages pierced. This was escalation by design, not impulse. The board chair could posture. The enforcer in crimson could posture harder, but numbers don't flinch. By morning, calendars would fill, interviews would begin, and premiums would climb. Consequences move quietly at first, then all at once, and tonight marked the hinge. Nothing else would be said until daylight forced truth into rooms that preferred shadows and ended the masquerade forever. Morning light filtered through the blinds of a rented conference room downtown, a neutral space chosen for conversations that needed receipts. I sat across from an insurance broker who had seen this pattern before. The clipboard queen had tried to outrun math. Math doesn't chase, it waits. Victoria Langley wasn't present, but her fingerprints were everywhere. The board chair's signature sat on the event rider, the addendum that shifted risk to the HOA. I asked the broker to walk me through exclusions. Slowly, he obliged. Physical interference, negligent supervision, late notice. 3 switches flipped at once. I slid the timeline across the table. The moment of contact, the medical emergency, the dawn phone call from the enforcer in crimson. The broker circled the call time. That, he said, changes everything. I nodded. Silence again, used correctly. By mid-morning, I relocated to a copy center near the courthouse. New location, same purpose. I requested certified copies of the HOA's policies and prior loss runs. The clerk raised an eyebrow. I smiled. Paper trails calm people. My phone buzzed. The tyrant in heels had sent another memo, this time urging cooperation and confidentiality. The language screamed containment. I forwarded it to the broker and added a single line. Please advise on coverage impact. At noon, I stepped into a quiet hallway and called the carrier's claims intake. I reported facts, not feelings. Names, times, locations. The operator paused when I mentioned pregnancy and torn garments. She escalated the file. Files are doors. Escalation opens them. The board, chair finally called. Victoria Langley's voice was smooth, rehearsed. She suggested mediation, a charitable donation, a reset. I asked whether she had notified her carrier before sunrise. She didn't answer. The enforcer in crimson prefers scripts. Questions break them. Afternoon found me at the hospital records office. New place, steady light. The intake nurse's notes were precise, times matched, stressors listed, witnesses named. Documentation doesn't argue, it accumulates. Outside, Eleanor Price waited, hands clasped. She handed me her coordinator report. It contradicted the board chair's memo. The clipboard queen had ordered staff to maintain decorum after the tear. That phrase carried weight. Control implies duty. Duty implies liability. Evening returned me home. I spread documents across the dining table, a map of exposure. The torn gown rested sealed nearby. The tyrant in heels had tried to minimize. Minimization multiplies cost. I drafted a notice of circumstances and sent it certified to the carrier, the venue, and the HOA. Not a threat, a marker. Numbers would speak next. Night settled. The board chair posted a smiling photo online. Optics lag reality. I turned off my phone and sat with the quiet. Tomorrow would bring adjusters, calendars, and premiums recalculated. The enforcer in crimson had escalated again. This time, escalation favored me. I checked on my wife. She slept, breathing even. I whispered a promise to the future we were protecting. The math was done. What remained was patience. Consequences don't rush. They arrive prepared. The board chair would learn that policies punish arrogance more reliably than crowds. By dawn, the first denial would land, and the room would finally feel cold. I gathered the files into a folder labeled simply Gala. Labels focus attention. I set alarms for early calls, then wrote a checklist of next steps. Adjuster interviews, venue compliance, board minutes. Each item narrowed options. The clipboard queen thrived on ambiguity. Clarity starves it. I closed the folder and turned off the lights. Tomorrow's leverage was already in motion, quiet and precise. The tyrant in heels had mistaken grace for weakness. Accounting would correct that error without raising its voice. I slept knowing the bill was coming, itemized, unavoidable, and deserved. Morning would confirm it all, with signatures, dates, and consequences stamped in ink no one could erase later. The next morning began with a knock that carried more weight than sound. 2 envelopes slid through the mail slot, thick, formal, unmistakable. I didn't open them right away. I made coffee first, the ritual steadying my hands. Victoria Langley liked urgency. I preferred sequence. The first envelope was from the carrier, a reservation of rights, carefully worded, politely devastating. The board chair's actions were now under review for coverage applicability. The phrase, potential exclusion, appeared twice. I read it, once, then set it aside where the light could see it. The second envelope came from the venue. A notice of incident, logged and forwarded. They cited the enforcer in crimson by name, her directive to intervene physically, her insistence on decorum over safety. The venue had insurance too. Shared risk becomes shared pressure. I drove to a municipal building downtown, a place of quiet counters and practiced neutrality. New location, new leverage. I requested copies of the event permit and security plan. The clerk printed them without comment. The clipboard queen had signed off on both. Signatures matter when policies collide. By late morning, my phone lit up with missed calls. The tyrant in heels had escalated again, looping in counsel. A letter followed, urgent and confident, asserting authority and denying fault. It referenced bylaws, not statutes. That told me everything. I forwarded the letter to the carrier adjuster, assigned overnight. I asked one question. Does this change your analysis? The reply came an hour later. It clarifies it. Adjusters speak softly when they're certain. Afternoon brought a meeting with the venue manager. He had deferred to the board chair that night. Now his posture had changed. He slid a copy of the incident log across the desk. Staff statements contradicted Victoria Langley's memo. The enforcer in crimson had overridden security protocols. Liability doesn't forgive overrides. Eleanor Price joined us briefly, eyes tired, voice steady. She confirmed timelines, added context, signed an affidavit. The clipboard queen's instructions were explicit. Maintain image. Prevent disruption. Ignore distress. Each verb carried cost. I left the venue and walked a block to a quiet park, phone pressed to my ear. The carrier adjuster explained next steps. Independent investigation. Recorded statements. Possible denial. Premium recalculation. The board chair's name would be attached to each line item. At home, I organized a call with the HOA's management liaison. He tried to soothe, to compartmentalize. I asked whether the board had notified their carrier before sunrise. Silence answered. The tyrant in heels had gambled on delay. Delay compounds damage. Evening brought a final call from Victoria Langley herself. Her tone had shifted, authority fraying at the edges. She suggested a private resolution, a settlement before things spiraled. I reminded her that spirals are mathematical, not emotional. She hung up. I checked on my wife, resting, monitored, safe. The stakes sharpened my focus. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about stopping a pattern. The board chair had used social power as a weapon. Financial reality would disarm it. Before bed, I sent a concise summary to the carrier, the venue, and the HOA council. Facts only. Attachments labeled. No adjectives. The enforcer in crimson had created a cascade she couldn't halt. Tomorrow, statements would be taken. Coverage positions would harden. The room would grow colder. I turned off the lights, knowing commitment had been made on every side but hers. The clipboard queen thrived on control. Tonight, control had left the building. Consequences were no longer hypothetical. They were scheduled, documented, and inevitable. Morning light cut across the kitchen table, where my phone vibrated again and again. I let it ring. Silence makes people talk faster later. The board chair had reached the phase where control slipped and confession often followed. I drove to a neutral place, a small coffee shop near the edge of the community, chosen because it belonged to no one. New ground matters when power shifts. Eleanor Price was already there, seated near the window, hands wrapped around a paper cup she hadn't touched. She didn't look up at first. Her shoulders were tight, posture folded inward, like someone bracing for impact that had already happened. When she finally met my eyes, I saw the cost of proximity to the enforcer in crimson. Authority burns those who stand too close. I didn't sleep, she said. The words came out flat. I kept replaying it. I waited. Confessions need space. Eleanor described the weeks leading up to the gala. Emails, checklists, pressure. The clipboard queen had been obsessed with image, demanding absolute control over appearance, movement, optics. Eleanor had flagged concerns, crowd density, access routes, medical contingencies. Each concern had been dismissed. Then came the night itself. Eleanor's hands moved as she spoke, tracing invisible timelines on the table. She recalled Victoria Langley intercepting my wife, the public correction, the physical reach. Eleanor had seen the moment the gown tore. She'd heard the gasp ripple through the room. She'd watched decorum give way to panic. I told her to stop, Eleanor said quietly. I said this wasn't okay. The tyrant in heels had responded without hesitation. Maintain order. Handle it. Don't make a scene. Eleanor's voice cracked when she described my wife's expression, the sudden shift from embarrassment to fear. Water breaking turned theory into emergency. Liability detonated in real time. I asked one question. Did you document it? Eleanor nodded. She slid a folded notebook from her bag, pages filled with timestamps and initials. She'd written everything down that night, habit drilled into her by years of crisis management. She'd also saved texts, directives, overrides. The enforcer in crimson had left a trail. Why now? I asked. Eleanor looked out the window. Because she asked me to change it, to rewrite the sequence so it looked accidental. That was the line. Alteration converts negligence into fraud. Eleanor signed a formal statement there at the table, hands steady now, resolve replacing fear. She agreed to cooperate fully with the carrier investigation. She understood the risk to her career. She also understood the alternative. Silence would tether her to the board chair's fall. As we stood to leave, my phone buzzed again. A message from the clipboard queen, short and clipped. "We need to talk, today." I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded Eleanor's statement to the adjuster and copied the venue's counsel. I added one sentence. "This clarifies intent. Intent reshapes coverage." By afternoon, the HOA management liaison called, voice strained. The carrier had scheduled recorded statements for the board. Coverage was formally questioned. The tyrant in heels would have to answer under oath, not to neighbors, but to policy language. Victoria Langley sent another message, this one pleading. She suggested mediation, discretion, mutual benefit. The board chair had mistaken leverage for loyalty. Neither existed anymore. I returned home and checked on my wife again. Her hand found mine without looking. Strength doesn't announce itself. It anchors. As evening settled, I prepared for the next phase. Eleanor's confession wasn't revenge. It was correction. The system had been misused, and now it was responding. Tomorrow, the preparation would become execution. The board chair had built her authority on perception. Now, documentation would dismantle it. The next morning I parked beneath the venue's loading dock, concrete echoing with footsteps that weren't mine. This was neutral ground again, but colder, procedural, built for invoices and signatures. Preparation thrives where emotions thin out. Inside, a temporary claims office hummed. Printers. Low voices. The board chair hadn't arrived yet, but her gravity was already present. Files stacked with color tabs told me where pressure would land. I met the insurance adjuster first. He was courteous, cautious, trained to listen without promising. I spoke in sequences, not accusations. Timeline, trigger events, policy exclusions. When physical interference meets medical emergency, coverage fractures. He nodded and took notes. Then the venue manager joined us, eyes darting. He confirmed access routes had been blocked at the clipboard queen's instruction. He confirmed staff had deferred because she claimed authority. The tyrant in heels had overreached, and witnesses had complied. I asked for one thing: incident logs, radio chatter, security camera indexes. Not footage yet. Indexes show intent without spectacle. He agreed. By noon, the enforcer in crimson arrived with counsel. She wore calm like armor, heels clicking, posture practiced. Victoria Langley smiled as if this were salvageable. Mediation language floated, mutual understanding, community harmony. I let it pass. When the adjuster asked for her statement, she spoke confidently, framing the night as decorum enforcement. She avoided contact. She described my wife as distressed but safe. The board chair tried to flatten the spike. I asked permission to clarify. The adjuster nodded. I presented Eleanor's timestamps, the venue logs, and the hospital intake chronology. Didn't raise my voice. Numbers do the lifting. I explained how altering sequence would constitute misrepresentation. The clipboard queen's smile tightened. Counsel interrupted, objecting to scope. The adjuster held up a hand. Scope expands when facts collide. We moved rooms. Preparation requires quiet pivots. In a smaller office, the adjuster disclosed preliminary findings. Assault allegations triggered exclusions. Failure to manage crowd risk voided protections. Post-incident interference threatened rescission. The tyrant in heels stared at the table. Victoria Langley requested a pause. She asked for a call with the board. I watched her leave, authority evaporating step by step. The enforcer in crimson had built control on certainty. Now uncertainty bled through. I used the pause to plan execution. Preparation isn't confrontation, it's alignment. I emailed a summary to the HOA management liaison, copied the carrier, and included options. Temporary suspension of the president, independent review, public notice to members, financial transparency. Each option reduced damage. Refusal magnified it. The adjuster returned with a timeline for recorded statements and a notice of reservation. Language matters. Reservation means risk has shifted. Outside, rain started, thin and persistent. I called home. My wife's voice steadied me. She asked if it was working. I told her the truth. It was moving. During the lull, I reviewed policies again, not for loopholes, but for pressure points. Deductibles, aggregate limits, duty to defend. Every clause tells a story about fear. I sketched a sequence for tomorrow. Who speaks first? Who interrupts? Who sits silent? Silence can be evidence. I flagged community bylaws that promise safety, not spectacle, and noted the gap between promise and practice. Preparation is choreography. You place facts where egos trip over them. When the crowd gathers, confusion becomes expensive. I was ready to let expense teach. Numbers don't argue, they accumulate, and accumulation changes behavior faster than anger ever could in rooms built for balance sheets and quiet signatures decide outcomes without applause. As I left the dock, I felt the turn. Not victory yet. Position. Evidence aligned. Witnesses committed. Money beginning to speak. Tomorrow, preparation would become public. The clipboard queen had forced a private night into daylight. Now the daylight would answer. By evening, the community center lights were already on, casting long rectangles across the parking lot. Preparation becomes visible when people arrive early. I walked in with a folder that looked ordinary and felt heavy. Inside were sequences, not secrets. The board chair arrived flanked by the HOA liaison, posture stiff, voice lowered. Victoria Langley scanned the room as if control could be reclaimed by presence alone. The enforcer in crimson nodded to neighbors she usually ignored. Tonight, eyes followed her. I took a seat near the aisle. Eleanor stood by, the refreshment table, hands clasped, weight shifting from heel to toe. She avoided my gaze, then met it, then looked away again. Conflict shows in the shoulders before it reaches the mouth. The clipboard queen opened the meeting briskly, agenda tight, tone clipped. She announced a brief update regarding the Gala incident, framed as a misunderstanding. I let the framing stand. Preparation means letting others misstate first. When public comment opened, a neighbor spoke about safety at events. Another mentioned confusion over authority. The tyrant in heels tapped her pen, impatience leaking through. I waited for the cue I'd planned. The HOA liaison attempted to close the topic. I raised my hand. Calm invites permission. The board chair granted it, lips pressed thin. I didn't accuse. I outlined. Timeline, policy language, carrier notice. I explained that a reservation of rights had been issued and that recorded statements were scheduled. I described how coverage reacts to physical interference and medical escalation. Numbers replaced adjectives. Victoria Langley interrupted, insisting the HOA had acted within decorum standards. I acknowledged decorum, then contrasted it with duty of care. Silence followed. The room leaned in. Eleanor stepped forward before she meant to. Her voice wavered, then steadied. She confirmed access routes had been blocked at instruction. She confirmed staff deferred because authority was asserted. The clipboard queen stared at her notes. A murmur rippled. The board chair attempted to regain order. I asked one question, softly. Who authorized physical contact? No answer came. I shifted to consequences without threats. Premiums adjust. coverage narrows. Personal indemnification dissolves when scope is exceeded. I reminded the room that leadership choices bind everyone financially. Preparation turns fear into arithmetic. The tyrant in heels requested a recess. The motion passed. In the hallway, conversations clustered. Neighbors compared experiences. Patterns surfaced. The enforcer in crimson stood alone, phone pressed to ear, voice tight. When the meeting reconvened, the board chair announced an independent review and temporary suspension of event enforcement authority. It wasn't an admission. It was a hedge. Preparation had done its work. I didn't smile. I watched Eleanor exhale. I watched neighbors straighten. I watched the clipboard queen write slower, each stroke deliberate. As the meeting closed, a local reporter approached the liaison. Questions formed. The tyrant in heels avoided the cameras, heels clicking faster than before. Control was slipping, not through spectacle, but through process. Outside, night air cooled the tension. I called home again. My wife asked if people understood now. I told her they were beginning to. Understanding takes repetition. Tomorrow would bring statements and numbers and letters. Tonight had been alignment. Preparation had become execution without fireworks. The board chair had tried to compress the story. The room expanded it. As I drove away, I felt the weight lift slightly. Not relief, momentum. The enforcer in crimson had relied on silence and certainty. Preparation replaced both with record and doubt. The next step would be public, unavoidable, and expensive. The tyrant in heels had taught the community a lesson she never intended. Morning arrived with paperwork instead of sirens, which felt right. I reviewed notes from the night before, marking sequences, not conclusions. The board chair had paused, not surrendered. Victoria Langley's power depended on delay, and delay was something I had already priced into the plan from the very beginning. By noon, the enforcer in crimson had issued a memo, carefully worded, announcing procedural updates. It sounded decisive while committing to nothing. I forwarded it to the carrier contact, highlighting phrases that shifted liability. The clipboard queen was unknowingly documenting her own retreat today, under growing financial scrutiny alone now. Eleanor called after lunch, voice steadier than before. She confirmed statements were scheduled and that venue staff had been advised to preserve footage. The tyrant in heels had tried to reroute requests through management, but preservation notices freeze games mid-move and stop quiet erasures before stories vanish forever completely cold. I drove to the venue to map exits and sightlines, not for drama, but accuracy. Risk lives in pathways. The board chair's authority evaporates when routes are blocked. I photographed signage and measured distances, building a neutral record that refuses emotion and stands firm against denial, spin, pressure later on. At home, I rehearsed nothing, choosing instead to rest. Preparation includes restraint. Victoria Langley thrives on reactions. Silence starves that engine. I checked messages from neighbors sharing similar stories, each confirming a pattern the clipboard queen could not erase anymore, across years, quietly, repeatedly, until now, together, aligned, documented, finally. The liaison requested a call, tone conciliatory. I listened, asked clarifying questions, and declined shortcuts. The enforcer in crimson wanted assurances without admissions. I explained process timelines, not outcomes. Process is where leverage hides, boring enough to be unstoppable when followed carefully, patiently, without spectacle, noise, threats, haste, shortcuts, ever. Late afternoon brought the carrier's acknowledgement, brief and precise. A reservation of rights was formalized. The board chair could still posture publicly, but privately the math had changed. Numbers don't argue. They accumulate until denial becomes expensive for everyone, especially those holding titles, gavels, clipboards, budgets, premiums, renewals, reputations, overnight. I walked the neighborhood at dusk, listening. People talk differently once fear loosens. Stories aligned with dates and directives. The tyrant in heels had normalized pressure. I noted times and witnesses, building a chorus that could not be dismissed easily. Later, publicly, under oath, lights, records, calendars, memories, together, strong. That night, Victoria Langley released a statement emphasizing compassion and cooperation. It mentioned policy reviews and listening sessions. It avoided responsibility. The clipboard queen mistook tone for cure. I saved the statement, tagging inconsistencies for tomorrow when questions arrive. Cameras roll, agendas open, minutes recorded, witnesses sworn, patience tested, publicly. I slept lightly, rehearsing sequences in my head. Tomorrow required calm. The board chair would attempt control through procedure. I would answer with procedure's shadow, consequences. Preparation turns anxiety into steps, and steps into inevitability without shouting. Spectacle, insults, threats, shortcuts, delays, excuses, mercy, bargains, favors, pressure, spin, noise, ever. Before dawn, I checked on my wife, breathing steady, hand warm. This was never abstract. The enforcer in crimson had crossed a boundary that night. Every calculation served one purpose, ensuring it never happened again to anyone here nearby. Later, publicly, quietly, officially, financially, procedurally, system-wide, permanently, ever, again, anywhere. As sunrise edged the houses, messages queued. The board chair requested attendance at an emergency session. I agreed. Implementation was complete. The next phase would be visible, communal, unavoidable. The tyrant in heels had invited witnesses by her own choices, words, memos, silences, signatures, schedules, rooms, lights, microphones, calendars, doors. I gathered my folder and keys, breathing once before moving. Momentum favors preparation. Victoria Langley would soon learn the difference between authority and accountability. I stepped outside, ready for the room where everything would finally be said aloud, recorded, witnessed, challenged, answered, resolved, concluded, together, publicly, calmly, lawfully, now, then. The room filled before the gavel ever struck. Folding chairs scraped, voices layered, and the low hum of anticipation settled into the walls. I took a seat near the aisle, not hidden, not centered. Visibility matters. Victoria Langley entered last, posture rigid, smile rehearsed, the board chair dressed for control rather than truth tonight. The enforcer in crimson opened with formalities, voice steady, eyes scanning faces like inventory. She framed the meeting as proactive, collaborative, forward-looking. The clipboard queen avoided the word incident. I noticed that omission immediately. Language reveals intent, especially when rooms are full and minutes are recorded for posterity, auditors, carriers, attorneys, and future boards. When public comment opened, neighbors rose one by one. Stories overlapped without coordination, a pattern emerging organically. The tyrant in heels shifted in her seat as timelines aligned. Fines escalated. Threats followed. Police mentions surfaced. The room leaned forward together, realizing this wasn't isolated. It was systemic, normalized, tolerated, until it wasn't anymore. Eleanor spoke next, hands clasped, voice measured. She described the gala without adjectives, just sequence. Who approached, where hands went, what tore, When medical staff were called, the board chair stared at the table, jaw tight. Facts don't shout, they stack. Each sentence added weight the enforcer in crimson could not deflect. I stood when recognized, heart steady. I stated my name and role without flourish. I outlined exposure pathways, referencing policies, exclusions, and trigger events. I did not accuse. I mapped consequences. The clipboard queen interrupted once, then stopped herself when murmurs rose. Interruptions look different when a room is watching closely. Questions followed, not from me, but from residents. Why were police called for dress codes? Why were private rules enforced publicly? Why did insurance premiums spike last quarter? The tyrant in heels answered selectively, deflecting responsibility to committees and vendors. Each deflection tightened the circle. Accountability hates diffusion. It demands a center. The venue manager spoke, voice apologetic, explaining deference to HOA authority. That admission landed hard. The board chair's authority had traveled beyond its lane. I clarified jurisdiction gently, citing contracts. The enforcer in crimson nodded once, realizing the record now showed overreach, not misunderstanding. Overreach is expensive in ways apologies can't fix. A carrier representative joined by phone, tone neutral, language precise. A reservation of rights had been issued pending review. Coverage could be limited. Premiums would adjust. The clipboard queen's pen stopped moving. Silence spread. Financial reality entered the room and took a seat. People understand numbers, especially when they threaten shared resources. Victoria Langley finally spoke directly, voice controlled, acknowledging concerns and proposing a committee. The tyrant in heels promised reforms without admitting fault. I responded briefly, stating that committees don't halt exposure already triggered. Process matters, but timing matters more. The room understood. You can't unring a bell once policies are breached. A motion was introduced to place the president on temporary leave pending review. It passed with visible relief. The board chair exhaled, shoulders lowering, authority slipping quietly. No cheers followed, just a collective release. This wasn't vengeance, it was correction. The system recalibrating itself under light, witnesses, and documented consequence. As the meeting adjourned, people approached me with thanks and stories. I redirected them to Eleanor and the liaison, emphasizing process. Change sticks when it's shared. The enforcer in crimson avoided my eyes while packing up. The clipboard queen left without comment. Accountability doesn't require confrontation. It requires records and resolve. Outside, night air cooled the tension. I checked my phone. Messages from carriers confirmed next steps, reviews, audits, adjustments. The tyrant in heels had lost the room, but the work wasn't finished. Consequences unfold over time, quietly, inexorably, until behavior changes or leadership does. I walked home under streetlights, thinking of the doorway where this began. The boundary held. Tomorrow would bring paperwork, not panic. That's how justice often looks when it works. Calm, procedural, unavoidable, and finally, effective. Morning light touched the doorway where everything began, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like mine again. I stood there listening to quiet, thinking about how authority changes when it's forced to face limits. Victoria Langley learned that lesson the slow way, through paperwork, carriers, and consequences that don't fade overnight. The board chair released a statement before noon, careful and bloodless, acknowledging a temporary leave and a review process. The enforcer in crimson didn't mention names, but everyone knew whose absence mattered. Neighbors forwarded it to one another, relief traveling faster than gossip ever had. Control thrives in silence. Accountability spreads in daylight. By afternoon, the clipboard queen's power looked smaller than it ever had. Vendors paused contracts. The venue manager requested revised authority letters. Insurance notices followed, dense and unforgiving. Premium adjustments, coverage exclusions, requirements for training and oversight. None of it dramatic, all of it decisive. This is how systems correct behavior when emotion steps aside. Eleanor met me near the clubhouse, shoulders lighter than I'd ever seen. She thanked me once, then stopped herself, reminding us both that truth was enough. Conflicted witnesses don't need heroes. They need room to choose integrity. Watching her walk away felt like the cleanest victory of all. Victoria Langley sent one final email that evening, clipped and formal, announcing her resignation pending review outcomes. The tyrant in heels framed it as sacrifice for stability. I read it twice, not for satisfaction, but for confirmation. Words matter when they close doors that were never meant to be opened. The neighborhood meeting the next week felt different. People spoke calmly. Motions were specific. Limits were defined. Police references vanished from agendas. The board chair's seat stayed empty, a reminder that authority isn't permanent, it's conditional. It exists only as long as it respects boundaries and people. At home, my wife rested with our newborn, the torn gown folded away in a drawer we rarely open. That fabric stopped being evidence the moment our child arrived safely. Now, it's memory. A line between who we were before and who we chose to become after pressure tested us. I returned to work with a renewed respect for quiet leverage. Financial pressure isn't cruel when it's earned. It's corrective. It realigns incentives until harm becomes too expensive to repeat. Organizations learn faster from balance sheets than from outrage, and lasting change prefers that language. Neighbors began sharing their own stories, not for revenge, but for clarity. Patterns surfaced. Policies were rewritten. Training scheduled. A community that once whispered started documenting. That shift will outlive any single board member, including the enforcer in Crimson, who once believed decorum outranked dignity. Standing again at the doorway, I understood why this mattered beyond us. When rules pretend to be law, someone eventually gets hurt. When systems are challenged correctly, they recalibrate. That's the work. It's not loud, it's persistent, and it protects people who never asked to fight. That night, neighbors lingered outside, trading quiet nods and shared glances, realizing a line had moved. Emails slowed, texts softened. The clipboard queen's directives stopped arriving, replaced by silence and questions. The enforcer in Crimson no longer spoke for the group. Committees asked for guidance. Carriers requested documentation. Policies demanded signatures. Everyone felt the difference when pressure flipped direction, when accountability flowed upward, and when ordinary people discovered patience, records, and calm resolve could outlast intimidation every single time. It reminded everyone that boundaries, once enforced, rebuild trust faster than fear ever could together now. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. I closed the door gently, confident it would stay that way. Not because of fear, because limits were finally respected and power had been returned to where it always belonged.